the world. The systems bit is interesting though. So we live in the age of large scale emergent systems, right? The primary example of this is climate change, right? We exist in an age where our reach exceeds our grasp, and we are making change at scale. We don't really intend to, but unfortunately that doesn't really make a difference. If we learn to coexist with large scale systems, right? If we learn to actively manage them or live within them or kind of ride their changes in the places we can't manage them, then we get to keep globally organized civilization. If we don't manage this, then we don't get to keep it. And this is going to be something that impacts not just your lifetime, but my lifetime. So this is a very kind of short-term change. And yes, that was a reference on the first slide. Anyway, so this is what the future used to look like, right? We used to think about, the future as this sort of predictable mechanistic system. It was awful, right? We were staring at the end of the world. This is what the end of the world looked like in the late 50s and early 60s. But we understood it, right? We had this kind of conception that, this is kind of, there are great powers and things interlock, and there are adults in charge who, are being sensible about things. This was utter bullshit, of course, right? There's always more outside of the boundaries than exist inside the boundaries. This is a map of Zomia, which broadly speaking is defined as the area in Southeast Asia where it is either too high or too low to grow rice. And this is relevant because until kind of basically the invention of the train, the areas where you could grow rice were the areas where you had empire. And if you couldn't grow rice, you couldn't make empires happen. Now, the conventional narrative that people were given was, oh, there are these uncivilized tribes and the civilizing influence of these empires, pulls them in. But actually, that wasn't what happened at all. It was a lot of different collections of people who have, their own agency and choose to move in and out of civilization, depending on whether or not it happens to benefit them at that time. You can read more about this in The Art of Not Being Governed by James C. Scott, which I highly recommend. There will be a book list at the end of this. But, this is just kind of one of those little examples where, our stories, the stories that we use to tell ourselves about the world have always been wrong, but they're becoming more wrong, right? This is a sourcing map for a single ICU, right? Not a particularly complicated one. This is, dozens of steps, dozens of logistics flows, et cetera. If you look at something like a laptop, you wouldn't be able to see most of the map, right? Because it's just going to be a blur of different structures interrelating. Trying to and climate is even harder, right? We're dealing with these very large systems. Now there's a sort of a technical understanding, and we'll talk about this in more detail a bit later. There's a technical understanding of what a hard system like this means. But again, that leaves out all of the people. So a couple of definitions. Complex systems are systems that have emergent behavior. They're constructed generally, or can be seen as being constructed by the structured hierarchical composition of simpler systems. If you're familiar with the different schools of complex systems, I'm talking about Annapolis, not Santa Fe complexity here. Sociotechnical systems are systems that involve both human behavior and the interactions of technical systems. I spent a lot of time working in the security world, in the computer security world. All security problems are sociotechnical problems, are problems within sociotechnical systems. In fact, almost all problems of any meaningful scope are sociotechnical systems problems. The world never looked like that B-52, right? The feelings of people, all of those individual interactions have always mattered from the start, and not just the guy in the middle, right? Actually, it turns out that everybody who isn't in that room makes just as much of a difference on the flow of history. Now, adversarial systems are another subtype, which again, due to the way I work, I found particularly interesting to study. Adversarial systems are complex systems where human actors have conflicting goals. Often this includes actively trying to undermine the goals of other actors. All competitive situations have that structure, right? You know, war, business, security, politics, all of these things are these adversarial systems, or can in part be seen as these kinds of adversarial systems. I don't know how many people here are familiar with John Boyd's work. This is the OODA loop, right? This is the basic structure of planning in the presence of an adversary. This is the planning problem, basically, in a nutshell. Boyd was a Korean War ace who did a bunch of work on how fighter pilots fly planes or should fly planes. And he was the first one to come up with this idea of, or one of the first ones anyway, it's generally attributed to him, of this kind of control loop that humans run in their heads. You observe the world around you, you orient yourself in space and in kind of the decision space to your observations. You decide on a course of action, and then you act. And the interesting thing about an OODA loop from, well, there's a lot of interesting things. One of the things which is interesting is, all else being equal, the faster you can run that loop at the same depth, the more likely you are to be able to kind of outturn, outthink, outstructure your adversary. Or the more depth you can run it in. There's a bunch of different ways that fall out of that kind of structure and that kind of systemic understanding of adversarial behavior. But it's a useful model to have when you're thinking about these kinds of large scale systems. One of the other truisms, though, is that you cannot model collaborative systems within an adversarial frame, and you cannot model adversarial systems within a collaborative frame. You know, I've learned some very painful lessons here. When you are trying to outthink your adversary, right? When you are trying to turn inside the enemy, that consumes all available resources, all available energy in a fully adversarial condition. You cannot build a plan B, you know, within a structure where you're trying to execute at maximum velocity on plan A. And so the adversariality kind of forces the collaboration out of the room. And in the same way, as soon as you've got adversariality in a room, it undermines, and you end up with this kind of game theory defector math. This is one of the reasons why, when you're looking at social structures where large-scale trust starts getting eroded, you see people moving more and more towards this kind of maximally adversarial position, which is, you know, obviously relatively harmful. I don't know how many people are familiar with, by the way, Taylor Swift has a secondary career in information security. She doesn't talk about it much, but it's out there if you look on Twitter. So let's talk about our three orders of systems: infrastructure, structure, and superstructure. This is one of the decompositions for any problem, right? You have structure, which is the stuff that you're actually looking at, right? The scope of what the system is trying to manage in the world. You have infrastructure, which is all of the becoming invisible things that it depends on, right? You know, you think about, oh, I have this structure that I'm trying to build, and it is, you know, a inventory fulfillment thing. Well, okay, you depend on the postal system, you depend on the rule of law, you depend on all of these kind of layers below it. And then you have superstructure, which is your social or governance layer on top of it. The rule of law is possibly actually as much superstructure as it is infrastructure. So you can, any problem, any systemic problem you can look at, you can also divide in this way. So to a first approximation, all of the systems that are defining our survival are complex socio-technical infrastructural systems. They are the underlaying of the way that we try and act in the world. We are living in kind of the long tail of unintended consequences right now, the long tail of externalities. So an externality is defined as something which you don't consider within the scope of the current system. If you were General Motors or Ford in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s or the 2000s, although you knew starting from the 50s that global warming was real and that car emissions were significantly driving it, you chose to treat those as an externality because you could. They weren't something that you looked at. That was somebody else's problem. Unfortunately, now they're everyone's problem, right? We built these supply chains, and then we have all of these, millions of lives that are just sort of absorbed by externalities, that are catastrophically changing the way groups of people live. So Kranzenberg's first law is that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. I think this is a very important thing to keep in mind, especially in the context of a course like the courses at Hyper Island, because it's very easy as you get kind of closer towards the tech industry, as you get kind of pulled into that world, into that ecosystem, it's very easy to kind of have this sort of, even if it's not the kind of the naive techno solutionism that we saw, well, we still see, but we thankfully are starting to see a bit less of. But this idea that technology is just kind of neutral, right? It just, like, you can just take a system that is a manually run system and automate it, and it won't really change that much. I remember back in the days when Google really, really tried hard to pretend that don't be evil was a thing that they cared about. I think they may have even cared about it then. 2003, 2004, there was still this idea that, well, they had this goal of, like, we're going to reduce, we're going to improve access to all human knowledge, right? We're going to eliminate friction of access everywhere we can. But it turns out that, like, for instance, making, arrest records or making property ownership records searchable immediately by anyone in the world, right? That actually has a relatively deep impact on society. That is not a neutral change. It's also not necessarily a predictable change. Is it good? I don't know. In some cases. Is it bad? Yes, definitely in other cases. But we don't know, right? And it's very, like, now we can maybe start saying some things about, well, was this a good idea? Or what did this mean? But when you build a thing, this is, it's very difficult to understand what it's going to mean. This is a telephone wiring system in Stockholm at the turn of the start of the 20th century, right? We built this amazing kind of spectacular edifice with no idea what this actually meant. What does a phone system mean, right? We definitely didn't think it meant this, right? These are folks who are standing on the edge of the Mediterranean trying to be in Europe, because if you hold up your phone in a certain place, you connect to an EU cell network instead of a Moroccan cell network. And that changes the structure of your life. You move across a border without physically moving, with all of the political implications that come with that. This is Skype, right? The structure of the scale of global remittances versus foreign aid has changed spectacularly in line with the ease of people keeping in touch with each other internationally, right? It used to be that when you left home, you didn't see your cousins growing up, right? You move across the world, you don't necessarily see these things. You're not as connected to those communities. So it used to be that, development aid, that foreign aid was kind of, that was the B-52. That was the, the smart people trying to do the right thing. And then the internet kind of ate that, right? And then it turns out that these informal flows are so much bigger. To make all of this stuff work, we have built structures which are outside the scale of human experience. And it's very difficult in some ways to kind of really understand stuff moving at that scale. This map, by the way, is not just a map of submarine cables, it's also a map of all of the submarine cables that GCHQ and NSA tap. The nuclear bureaucracy, all of those kinds of state structures didn't go anywhere, right? The power relationship with the state has really fundamentally changed. And it's still changing again in a lot of different ways, right? The ability of states to surveil and control, but also to disrupt, is scaling incredibly quickly. This is my favorite slide from the Snowden releases. This is from the Joint Threat Research Intelligence Group, which is a division of GCHQ. Their job is large-scale cultural manipulation. Everything from screwing with the YouTube recommendation algorithm in a targeted way for specific individuals to try and change their mind about certain issues, to kind of large-scale psyops, et cetera. I love that they have anthropology and magic on this slide, and apparently ethnography was so important they needed to list it twice. But this has also been democratized, right? This is, I don't know. So I first made this this presentation, or some of the slides that this presentation was pulled from a few years ago, where the idea that we had large-scale meme wars in mid 2016, early 2017, that was still sort of weird, and people like the idea that there was an organized structure there was kind of not incomprehensible, but outside most people's experience, which I think it is definitely no longer outside of most people's experience. But during the first Trump election, there was this whole kind of Kekistani whatever movement that spun off 4chan and various other places. They taught like multiple college level courses in the theory of propaganda. They were actually relatively good courses, right? The degree of organization that was spun up out of chat rooms, out of IRC, out of very, very simple tools was really pretty spectacular, right? This is what it turns out a big chunk of the internet means, or the internet means, right? Is this thing showing up at scale. So we build tools, and then later maybe we find out what they mean. It would be nice, at least I think it would be nice, to maybe find out what some systems mean beforehand, or at least to start, thinking about what they mean beforehand. So we might actually have fewer unintended consequences, or at least new and different unintended consequences. So Keller Easterling uses the term disposition. I don't exactly like it as a word, but it's the least bad word that I've found. And she's talking about the propensity or kind of forward-looking structure of a system. So for instance, if you think about a chessboard, right? Chess has a disposition which you can think of as, well, okay, here's an opening, and then here's a branching probability structure that leads forward from that opening. And any given board position in chess has its own disposition. But now think of that in the context of a social system, right? Where you have these kinds of forward-looking probability structures, and they have flavors, right? They're not just a raw graph, but they have kind of a nuance to them. As a human, when we look at the disposition of a system, when we look at the structure of a system, we can form this kind of aesthetic perspective on it. It's the kind of the flipping around human perception and looking at it from the point of view of the system. It's not, the aesthetics here isn't the image of the system, right? Aesthetics is emergent from deep practice, right? You spend a lot of time staring at some category of systems, some structure of systems, and you start to see, is this a beautiful system? Is this an elegant system? Is this an interesting system? It's a kind of fitness function. Now, this is interesting because you can compress a lot of different ways of looking at a system into, is this system elegant, right? It's a superset of the ways that you can evaluate the fitness of a system. Ethics can be computed as a subset of aesthetics, right? Part of the beauty of a system is this system ethical? Does the system interact with the world in ways that I feel are acceptable? Now, this is not, this isn't just my idea. There's a long history of this idea, especially in some of the engineering disciplines. So there's this idea from aviation. If it looks right, it flies right. It took us a long time to understand how to build an airplane and like what made an airplane functional and useful, what gave it certain kinds of performance properties. We actually built and flew a lot of airplanes before we really understood a lot of things about how they worked, especially when we start getting into more like handling properties, dynamics, systems in motion, that kind of thing. And there was this idea, or really even still today, but certainly up until kind of the 50s and 60s and 70s, when computation started entering the equation and wind tunnel testing got advanced enough where we started being able to actually predict, right? If it looks right, it flies right. This bias is still here, right? There is a certain aesthetic shape of things. If it looks right, it flies right. And that designers still kind of pay attention to, because it's part of how we understand the object. Now, there are absolutely exceptions to it, right? There are very, very weird things that don't really look right and can fly and can do interesting things, but they require explicitly stepping away and stepping beyond that. The plane on the right there is, oh gosh, which one is that? The X-14, I think? No, X-34. It's one of the NASA experimental designs. And if the computer on that thing crashes, it falls out of the sky, unless it's supersonic. A human cannot fly it in subsonic regime. And there's a reason why, like from an aviation designer's perspective, those forward swept wings, et cetera, a bunch of this stuff looks like creepy. It's wrong. It doesn't meet that aesthetic filter. So system aesthetics are a learned object, right? They come from experience. They're a cultural object. They're a styled object. There are trends. There are feelings. All of these things. It's not cut and dry. This isn't a technocratic way of looking at a system. One of the things which was really interesting for me, I spent, I don't know, like the first 8 or so years of my career in security, spending a lot of time staring at a lot of different code bases. Probably read some number of millions of lines of code. And you get to the point where you can sort of look at a function, look at a class definition, and be like, oh yeah, that one was written by somebody at Microsoft, and this one was written by somebody at Adobe, because there's a culture and it's like an aesthetic to the way they think about and break down problems. So one of the things which relates to this, right? If we are thinking about moving outside of our current understanding of systems, right? We have a current way that we're acting. We have a current set of principles and assumptions. We have a current set of social scripts and rituals. We want to get outside of that. Part of that is shaking up our aesthetic understanding, or giving our aesthetic understanding different and novel things to work with. I think of high weirdness as this kind of strategic resource. You need a certain amount of it in your life to be able to kind of like get the shape that reality should be. If you get too far away from it, you end up just falling into these kind of normative patterns. You end up believing the lies that, you know, whichever empires you're part of want to tell you about the shape of the world. So play is really interesting here. Play is how we learn things that we don't understand. It's why kids do it so much, right? Because they don't understand the shape of the world yet. So they need these kind of tentative structures that let them experiment and let them, you know, make believe and let them, you know, take leaps of judgment without consequences, without deep consequences in the same kind of way. And often, unfortunately, as we get older, we move away from play. We end up kind of, no, we're just gonna use these more structured ways of understanding. But there are limits there to how useful that is, right? That only lets us solve problems that we already know roughly how to answer. And so in the next session, I will talk a little bit about play and a way of playing and answering. Shay, it sounds like there are people in the waiting room that you could maybe let in. That said, yes. I'm also going to give everybody a few minutes to take a break. If people have questions, now's a great time to ask them about kind of the first chunk of the talk.
A question?
Yep.
If it's a good time, yeah. What you said about adversarial systems and social something systems and how they can't coexist, or like that it's either or. I'm not sure if I understood correctly, but how do you think about like co-creation in, for example, business or in an environment that could be an adversarial system? If business is adversarial, does co-creation have a place between businesses, or how would you see that situation?
So the structure, the opposition was adversarial versus collaborative. Sociotechnical systems is just kind of systems that mix the social world and the technical world. I think that, so business writ large, right? Capitalism is an adversarial system. It's adversarial across classes, it's adversarial between actors. And it's, you know, well, certainly from the top down, you know, actors will try to structure it as zero sum. You can create collaborative bubbles inside adversarial systems, right? You know, if you think about it, like ideally, many firms internally are operating more in a collaborative mode. Now, that's rarely actually true. Departments compete for budget, people compete for promotions, right? There's always that structure overlaid in, but you can absolutely create bubbles inside firms and possibly, you know, even between firms, which create room for that collaboration. But for instance, it's very difficult for many companies to create products in a fully collaborative way with their users, right? Because the thing that they're trying to do is fundamentally get more money from a given set of people or get the same amount of money from more people, right? There is always some opposition in interests. And the more of that opposition there is, the more likely it is to shift into an adversarial mode. You know, for instance, I don't know what your relationship with Facebook is. Mine is overtly hostile, right, to Facebook, the company. They are an adversary who control infrastructure that I'm forced to use. And the way they control it is actively hostile to my interests.
Great answer, thank you.
Could I also ask a question?
We'll take a couple more minutes if folks want to run to the bathroom or anything.
Okay, Saga, thank you for the good question. I have a similar question. From your point of view, how would you like to describe a political system? For instance, like in Sweden, we have a party system where different parties are sometimes competing, but also like cooperating with each other. So in this case of like increasing the collective intelligence, how would you describe the political scene?
Well, it is always necessarily at least somewhat adversarial. You know, a functional government is hopefully more collaborative than not, but you know, politics kind of at this low level is, you know, looking at resource allocations and divided understandings of resource allocations in terms of like, you know, who should get what, whose interests get you know, get listened to. So there's, you know, in reality, systems are often mixed. I would say that in many contexts, it is like you can still have cooperation sometimes within adversarial systems, right? You know, if you look at, you know, like the nuclear war is probably one of the best studied and best modeled adversarial structures. And there are a bunch of places where even at the height of the Soviet Union and the US collaborated actively, right? Because there were places where they had, even in the context of nuclear wars where adversaries were kind of on a knife edge of destroying the entire world to get the other guys, there were times when their interests aligned. You know, and that's obviously, that's an extreme example, but you know, there's this kind of, when you are looking at a system from within a fully collaborative frame, there can be this kind of assumption of trust and assumption of goodwill, which unlocks very different kinds of collaboration, right? It lets people put down that adversary modeling loop. And that's something interesting, right? And that's where you get a difference in kind. Anybody else? If not, I will go ahead and get started again. So next up, I want to talk a little bit about Nordic LARP. I live in Finland. I actually moved to Finland because of Nordic LARP. Let me know in the chat if we have any LARPers in the class. I'm very curious, or folks who are familiar with it. Anyway, if you're not familiar with Nordic LARP, we're not talking about this as much. It's less people running around in elf costumes in the forest, which I'm sure can be great fun, but that's not quite what we're talking about. So the Nordic LARP community started there in the same way that live action role playing did in many places around the world. And at some point, kind of in the mid 90s, this slightly more collectivist understanding of society led to people saying, well, okay, well, maybe we could take first costuming a bit more seriously, right? We could work to you know, kind of raise that bar, because sort of I'm responsible for the experience that everyone around me has, so therefore I'll do my part. And then eventually that bled over into looking at things like story and setting and kind of the seriousness of the stories that we tell. So I'll give a few examples, and then I'll tie this back why this is interesting in this context. So the first game I want to mention is called Just Little Oven. Just Little Oven was played over 3 consecutive days. First played in Norway in 2011 for about 75 people. And it was set in upstate New York in the gay scene at the start of the AIDS epidemic, set over 3 consecutive 4th of July parties in 81, 82, and 83. And, you know, it was a game about the fear of death, but also about friendship and about desire. And it was an incredibly deeply meaningful and moving experience. You know, it was, if any of you have seen Angels in America or A Normal Heart, some of the kind of, you know, the other media that's been made about the AIDS epidemic, the kind of seriousness that, you know, that those stories are told with there. it was very much in that kind of same mode of storytelling. And the interesting things that come out of this are this feeling of deep immersion into a character, into a time, into a place. And I'm not going to say that having played this game, I understand what it was like to, it's not that. It's not experience exactly, right? But it is a deep empathy, and an empathy that sticks with you much more than many other media properties do. Here's another game called Panopticorp. This is a game about sort of a parody, a satire of an advertising agency where they have this internal cool meter and this whole kind of in-house language, and everybody's this hyper competitive second by second. I have to make the coolest new thing today sort of structure. So there's a lot of different registers that you can build fiction from within. Here's another game called Halat Hisar. This was a Finnish game or a Finnish-Palestinian game set in an occupied Finland, very much mirroring the Palestinian experience. It was an incredibly moving game, and it provided this very deep kind of empathy and this structural understanding of like, what does this mean? What does it mean to live through this story? What does it mean to have these sets of interactions? How does it change the way you see the world, change the way you see yourself, change the way you act? And again, it has this, it stays with you, right? It gets under your skin in a very different kind of way. So in a lot of contexts for, looking at kind of design fiction structures, we talk about interaction, right? Oh, I've got an interactive, I've got something that I can interact with, right? Which often means I can poke at a button and then a light goes on, right? This is not, it's technically interactive, right? The person is doing a thing, but it's not actually changing anything. I see someone mentioned gamification in the chat. That is the polar opposite of what I'm talking about, and I'll get to why in a minute. So when we talk about immersion, often it's interactive. I can push a button, but I'm pushing a button in a context which has been aesthetically designed to kind of so that everything matches, right? So I've got, instead of I'm pushing a button in a blank wall and a light goes on, I'm pushing a button in Disneyland and a light goes on, right? There's this kind of immersive scenography. Now, neither one of these are really participating, right? You're just walking through this experience. The thing with gamification is gamification is kind of the shallowest way of participation, right? It's saying, instead of creating some kind of intrinsic motivation, I'm going to create a counter system. I'm going to create a gambling system. I'm going to create some set of rules that move tokens around and give someone things to do, but there isn't, like, the human isn't involved, right? This is creating an extrinsic motivation. And if you look at the literature on motivation, extrinsic motivation basically always destroys intrinsic motivation, right? The thing which you want to be doing in a participatory context is creating a way for people to have an intrinsic motivation to interact with a narrative structure that gives them agency. Now, the really interesting thing to me is doing this in an embodied way. Now, under our current circumstances, that still doesn't have to mean that, like, oh, you just can't do this, right? There's a difference between interacting with an online experience where you're interacting as a browser window, right? Like, that is your body, versus bringing the room that you're in into it, right? Bringing the body that you are in into it. If think about flirting with somebody on video chat, right? You know, you all know that you can have these incredibly embodied, very immersive, very participatory experiences. The fact that there's a video camera and a screen involved doesn't really make a difference, right? Or it makes a difference, but it doesn't mean that your body comes out of the picture, right? So I think that like that angle, right? That's where you get the body in. That's where you get the different kinds of learning in. That's where you unlock different kinds of learning experiences, right? This is where you get the empathy that stays with you rather than the empathy that, oh, that was cool. You know, that was a fun video game. And now I'm going to put it down and do something else, right? And this isn't to say that non-embodied mediums are useless, right? You know, there's a lot of good you can do with them, but there's a very different thing when you have a medium that brings your body into it. Attempting to own narratives is super boring. If you are trying to tell a story about a thing that you already understand, then you're not really doing this kind of embodied work, right? The point is to give people agency to participate. And that means, and this is mostly just sort of a warning, as you're looking at designing experiences, you have to kind of put the idea of, I'm going to tell a story about the world down, right? You're making room for other people to tell their own stories. If there isn't enough room and there aren't enough tools in the thing that you've given people for them to use it to tell their own story, then it's probably not interesting, right? Now, you get to talk about a lot of different things, right? You still have a lot of kinds of control. You know, you get to define the world, you get to define the affordances, you get to do a lot of these things, but the actual path that someone takes through, the actual meaning that they construct, that's the thing that they do, and that's the thing where you have to trust them to do that, right? This is the collaborative magic in this context, right? Is designing something that is open to their interactions. So there's a few things that you need to do if you're going to try and make this possible for someone. You need to tell people who they are, right? You need to give people an identity in the world so that they know kind of how they're approaching it. Now, that identity can be you are yourself in a slightly different world, right? You are yourself in a world where X and Y mean something else. Often slightly thicker characters, slightly thicker identities are easier for people to pick up, especially if they're new to this. On the other hand, kind of the more difference somebody needs to do, you know, for some people, picking up that character will be a challenge, right? Because it requires them to kind of invest and be open to actually participating in the experience. On the other hand, and this is often critical, characters give alibi, right? If you want people to do something which is very different from their ordinary life, because you want them to explore a future or a standpoint in our world, which are very different from the positions that they occupy now, you need to give them alibi so that they can kind of step into a magic circle, which has different rules, and then actually go do those things, right? You need to give them a way of saying, oh, okay, no, I know that normally I would never do this thing, but here it's okay, here I'm allowed to. The canonical example of magic circle in games is a boxing ring, right? Outside of a boxing ring, if you knock somebody out, you're a criminal. Inside a boxing ring, if you don't knock somebody out, you're a failure, right? It's literally a circle that changes the rules of society. Obviously, not everything needs to be that dramatic, but that same idea, that same concept comes with it. And obviously that means there's transitions, et cetera. One of the other things that you need to tell people is what affordances their world has, right? We're looking at our larger frame, at least in this talk, is talking about systems in the world, right? And talking about how we understand systems in the world. So you need to show people how the systems in the world that they interact with work, like at least from the user perspective. You need to show them how they break. Failures are often way more illustrative than successes. And you need to do it to the level of detail that's required for them to be able to tell the kinds of stories that you're interested in seeing told, right? Affordances allow action. If you don't have affordances, they can't do anything. You need enough depth for them to engage. Almost always, if you're designing some kind of experience, you want to talk more about social structures than about technical structures, right? You can introduce technical structures, and often if you're thinking about explaining kind of socio-technical systems, there is this like, oh, but we have to explain all the technical structures that are in the world. But you only need to introduce as much of them as you need to kind of motivate and justify the social systems, because those are the things that people are actually going to interact with. Because remember, it's embodied participation. It's people interacting with each other that is the thing that drives that kind of empathy. One of the things that I often see when folks from non-LARP backgrounds, especially from artistic backgrounds, try and bring in, try and come and play in LARP or LARP-like worlds, is this idea that, oh, we don't want rules. Rules are going to stifle people. Rules are affordances. Rules provide a space in which to act. If you have a system with no rules, it's almost always very boring. Another thing, again, as we're talking about kind of a design fiction frame, et cetera, discovering something novel during runtime, during play, is often really hard and doesn't actually tell very much about the thing unless everybody already understands the social context. It's actually often much more interesting to explain the social context to people because you can convey it a lot better outside of play. And then just sort of live with it and have some little vignettes of living with this social context that's already been communicated. One of the things that you need to do, one of the critical things that you need to do is explain what people actually do in the LARP or in the future that you're trying to build. You need concrete answers to this. They need to make sense. There needs to be reasons why people care about them. Ideally, those reasons should relate to the kinds of stories you want to tell. And there needs to be enough of it to occupy the time that you want the experience to take. Social scripts and rituals and relationships are your primary tool for creating societies, right? This is what it means to give somebody a who I am, right? Who I am is mostly a question of your relationships, right? And the world you interact in is something that you can break down into scripts. So like everybody knows probably the script for ordering in a restaurant, right? Many of you have probably seen that if you go somewhere else in the world with a significantly different culture, the script for ordering in a restaurant is actually not nearly as fixed as we think. There are a lot of variations, and some of these will really trip you up if you don't know them going in. Like how money is handled in restaurants in Germany and the US, totally different, right? Completely different structure of interaction. But these are things that you can define, and you can define them very concretely, and you can practice them, right? You can practice them so that they achieve a kind of pastness and a familiarity that lets people, do them comfortably. You can have rituals that are kind of, longer set pieces composed of scripts that define like transactions of social meaning. Again, thinking about breaking down your experience into these things and the identities that you provide people into these building blocks is really useful. Before you go in, you should understand what you want to achieve, right? You have goals. The goals may be to communicate. The goals may be to let people explore. The goals may be just to tell a really cool story about something that you think is interesting or weird or important. When you're doing that, you have the whole experience to define, right? There are at least 5 different phases. I will give you a copy of these slides afterwards. They have lecture notes in them, so you don't have to write this down right now. But there are 5 different phases that you need to design at least when someone hears about the experience and makes the choice to sign up or start to participate. Any pre-experience preparation you've asked them to do. I'll ask that question later, just so I can get back to it. Any pre-experience preparation you've decided to ask them to do. So go read this book, come up with a costume that looks sort of like X or matches this character you've been given. Make sure that you have a clean and calm and quiet place to do X, you know, whatever that kind of prep, right? That is part of the thing. That is part of the experience. Workshops and briefings, right? If you have scripts that you need people to perform, you should practice them before you start runtime, you know, before you enter the fiction. You know, telling people parts about the world. Always tell people things. If they're important to the experience, you must tell them at least twice in 2 different mediums, probably one in writing and probably one verbally in the briefing. Assume that people will, you know, assume that some people will miss the briefing, assume that some people won't read anything you write beforehand. You know, it's just kind of belt and suspenders for all of this stuff. Then the runtime. Most people remember to define the runtime when you're in the fiction, interacting, participating, doing these things. And then debriefing, right? The part after the experience, right? So this is where you talk about what happened. If you've had an emotionally intense experience, it is very useful for people to have some time to talk about what they felt and how they interacted with people, right? You know, often in Nordic LARPs, we're kind of playing to lose, right? We're looking for the interesting, intense emotions, not necessarily succeeding at the game. And that often means, you know, it means conflict. It means a lot of these other emotions that we maybe steer away from in other parts of our life. And that means that you need to give people a chance to kind of handle those emotions and deal with them and get through them and talk to each other and maybe apologize to each other or thank each other or whatever. And then also this is contextualization, right? This is saying, okay, so you've just had this experience. Here's how it relates to reality. There are a number of schools, especially in Denmark, UFTA schools, which use LARP as one of their primary teaching mechanisms. Broadly speaking, we can say that research happens before play and then learning happens after play. Play creates emotions and empathy and motivation and gives you a store of experience to reflect on, but then the actual learning is contextualization and discussion after the experience. This is especially important if you are looking at participatory experiences as kind of an instrumental tool to change people's relationship with the world or with systems. You have to have the contextualization part or people are going to miss most of the value. So that's a huge brain dump of stuff. We'll get to thinking about systems in practice next, where I'm going to talk about some ways to actually apply this stuff. But let's take another break real quick. I am actually going to take a break for like a minute. I will be back, and then we can ask questions about this chunk before we move on to the last one. Okay. There was a question about script ritual relationship. Is it a language question?
It wasn't a question really. I was just
Oh, I see. Sorry. Yes, I get it now. Talking about the weather. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. I would say that that is a script that builds relationships. You can also think of it as a ritual frame in some contexts, but like the actual talking about the weather, right? There's a script for how you talk about the weather, but then it serves a ritual purpose. Less of the Swedish context, but like in the UK, you cannot start a business meeting without first having a conversation about the weather that sort of gets everybody comfortable and, sets the stage for whatever you're going to talk about.
I was thinking like it's small talk, and maybe small talk in relationships that you don't feel entirely comfortable. So it's like a script for a ritual to connect relationships or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you can also think of like, there's a script for, there are many scripts, but there's a bunch of culturally transmitted scripts that are different depending on the culture for asking someone to marry you, right? Which is, again, there's a script and a ritual kind of embedded there at the same time. Almost all of our kind of big cultural moments have a bunch of different scripts associated with them that we kind of rehearse and learn and talk about and all of this kind of thing. And changing those is an incredibly easy way to change people's understanding of what the society that they live in is, right? You can create, even in a relatively long experience, like especially in a longer experience where you've got some kind of time to relax into it and spread out, like these kind of multi-day things, you create a few rituals, a few scripts, you fill in a few pieces, and then, the participants will fill in the rest, right? They will add nuance, they will bring things to life, that kind of thing. Assuming that they have the agency to actually do this, assuming that they've got the affordances for how the systems that they need to interact with work. And this is one of the reasons why I talk about this kind of system affordances, because you can't predict what is interesting there, right? If you already knew the story that somebody was going to want to tell, you wouldn't need to create this thing. The whole point is that it's this kind of tentative mode. It's learning things that are genuinely new and letting people use their creativity. So therefore, you have to give them room to improvise. You have to give them the tools to kind of actually have those interactions that you didn't predict.
Have you seen Jane Elliott's experiments?
I don't know if I have offhand.
She's been doing it since the 70s, I think, like blue eyes, brown eyes experiment.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, I'm familiar. I mean, this is sort of, it's kind of like that, but that's sort of like, in some ways, that is, like, those are both very interesting experiments in the context of, like, they're interesting experiments in a psychological context. They're interesting experiments in terms of conveying a very narrow empathic lesson, but the difference here is that for the most part, we're trying, like, that experimental structure, that kind of story structure doesn't give people room. Like, there's one story that's being told, right? That's fully determined. So it's not, emotionally complicated, possibly, painful or disturbing, depending on the material experiences, right? People need to have some idea of what they're getting into. They need to know, you know, that like the gotchas aren't interesting, right? You know, putting somebody in a situation like, haha, this means X, generally just makes them annoyed and makes them less receptive to the message. You know, that's sort of it's an adversarial mode versus a collaborative mode. So I want to talk a little bit about thinking about systems in practice, and this will kind of bring the two parts of this together. Looking at, so we have this tool for building experiential narratives, right? And we have the systems in the world that we like to understand. So here's kind of you know, here's your obligatory 2x2 for this talk. You can talk about sensing a system or changing a system. You can talk about looking at the structure of a system, and you can talk about looking at the affect or the emotional context of a system. And that gives us our kind of our four structures. So when we talk about reading a system in this context, this is just my language, we're often talking about this kind of technocratic systems modeling where you have like, you know, stock and flow modeling for kind of hard systems understanding of like, how do different parts of a system relate? This is the technocratic model of the system. Writing a system is, you know, the technocratic governance of a system, right? You know, all of the kind of structural politics of how you change things. It's regulatory domains. It's, you know, soft infrastructure. This is the UK government's nudge unit, cultural manipulation, propaganda, bribery, grant programs, censorship, right? These are all tools that power in one way or another use to shape hard systems of different kinds. Some of these tools we like, some of them we don't like, depending on our relationship with the rule of law. But these mostly fit in that same kind of bucket. So when we talk about understanding, like sensing the emotional meaning of a system, this is where we get into kind of immersing in a system. I'll give a few examples for these. My favorite quote from my favorite folk singers is a guy named Utah Phillips who died in 2008. Korean War vet, kind of knew everybody through the 60s and 70s. And he used to say the most radical thing you can have in America today is a long memory. I think this is true everywhere. You know, he was a very American folk singer, but you know, at the kind of height of American empire. But it's true everywhere. The work that we did collectively in the teens and the 20s to win labor rights, right? The scale of that work, the scale of the transformation of society that was collectively driven is something that we have kind of forgotten. Like there are not that many people who have that sort of visceral understanding of what that took, which I think is really interesting in the context of another moment where we kind of need a bottom-up coming together if we want to survive, because the oligarchs are very happy to let us all die. Transnational solidarity, right? We are dealing with emergent problems at global scale. Therefore, we should probably learn to get better at thinking like a single planet than thinking like individuals hiding in our own bunkers of our own social class in our own country, in our own city. Understanding the oppressions that different people deal with, understanding oppressions that are not yours, right? Not going to say understanding what the experience is, but getting a more than just intellectual feel for the lives of different people, one that lets you look at a set of policies, a set of changes, and understand what they might mean to people who are not you, who do not share your body, who do not share your life experience. These kinds of things are things that we can do with that immersive mode. The embodying mode, right? Because we also want to build experiences that actually change the world, right? Now, I have to say, just as a caveat, building these kinds of very dense experiences is an incredibly ineffective way of changing the world because it doesn't scale, right? These are sort of very high commitment media, but it can drive people to do other things that scale, right? You don't necessarily have to reach 1 million people to change the world if you reach 100 people who all go and devote their lives to something. And embodying that emotional understanding of what a system means is part of how you make those changes, right? There's a few examples in here. Some of these are quite old, so I'll skip through them a little bit. In Dar es Salaam, there are water points in a bunch of different places. And these water points are breaking down constantly. That is the sole source of clean water that many folks have. Now, the way that currently they're maintained, there's a very centrally oriented system which was kind of dropped in that lets people put in reports and dispatch plumbers and that kind of thing. But that means this very, so Tarifa is the system that dispatch structure is built on. That means a very kind of centralized politics is built into this, right? It is, in some ways, it is a colonialist system, right? It's, I think it's a good system in some ways, but it is a colonialist system in that there is an outside structure that has brought in the centralized system and imposed a governance structure on a local population for their own good, even if it's genuinely for their own good. I've worked on an application called Briar, which looks at how we do decentralized communications, right? Where you have phones talk to phones. There doesn't need to be a central anything. I hesitate a little bit for this example because what I am talking about has absolutely nothing to do with blockchains, Bitcoin, or anything in that world. I think that many of those systems are really just a different kind of colonialism. But this is talking about saying, okay, you need to do infrastructural maintenance, right? There are a lot of tasks that are the challenges that face us that are these kinds of things happen in the world in a distributed way, and care work, repair work, labor needs to be done on those things also in a distributed way. Whether this implies a centralized politics or a decentralized politics can mean very different things to the ownership that people have on the society and the systems that they interact with, right? And so looking at tool sets that let us decompose centralized governance structures into local governance structures, into collaborative structures that are less about kind of the application of structural violence via governance and more about people working together for collective interests is interesting. And so this is something where you have a system that has this combined, complicated social structure and complicated technical structure, which can overlay on each other in interesting ways. I don't know how many folks here have any background in architecture, spatial design. One of the interesting things here is that there's a really long tradition in architecture of physical design, and in some ways there's a tradition of like program design, of use design, of designing how a space is used, but there is really very little tradition in some ways of designing what a space means emotionally, right? What is a good space from the perspective of the user, not just in terms of affordances, right? Not just in terms of like, this space keeps me warm and all of the things are in the places where I expect them to be and the electrics work and the room is big enough and it's well lit. This is Hygge, right? This is, you come into a space and it's some community hall and, it's okay, it's fine, but you don't really want to spend time there. And so this is another place where you can look at rereading architecture, often the program diagram is the architectural instrument, which I think is most interesting for this as a place to start. looking at Christopher Alexander's work here is another interesting entry point. And this is kind of another one of the modes of saying that, okay, well, we have an object that satisfies certain structural criteria for its use. It provides the necessary affordances, but does it emotionally mean the thing we need it to mean? And how do we make it mean that more? You know, this is the antidote to a lot of kind of tech industry design where it's white and it's got rounded corners and it does something cool and I kind of hate it and I don't want to interact with it and it inspires absolutely nothing, you know. And also hopefully something that lets you get beyond the next step of, oh, it's cute, it's twee, it's, you know, it's that thing, but it's not, still not very human somehow. Here's another example. So in Marine basic training, the DoD gives 1 full day out of a 6-week basic training course, which is a huge time investment by their standards, to what it means to be a good stranger, which is basically, to a large part, like de-escalation training across cultural boundaries, i.e. you've just thrown a breaching grenade through the wall of someone's living room. Now calm everyone down and have a conversation with them. I'm not, and they call it training and being a good stranger, right? I have a lot of complex thoughts about this. This is not something that I exactly like, but it is a really interesting example of a thing that you can do from a standpoint in the world to try to change emotional reactions and emotional intelligence and understandings of situations and systems. You know, in this context, I mean, hopefully, maybe in some cases, this results in less people getting shot. On the other hand, maybe it results in the, you know, empire being more effective. So maybe that's, I don't know. I'm not going to try and pass judgment on it here, but it is an interesting example of a use case, you know, like an edge case, but a use case of trying to embody the affective meaning of a system as a way to change the outcomes of that system. So talk a little bit about the toolkit and specific things that you can try and do in the immersing and embodying phases. So one of the things that the immersing phase is really good at is basically this kind of diagnostic frame, right? You need to understand what the power relationships are in a situation, right? So I've got a system, I've got a social context. I know that it's got a bunch of things I don't understand about it yet. So let's try and just live in it a bunch with various different intents and see what kinds of stories and interactions and power structures come out of that, right? You know, like for instance, how do you, if you think about like griefing in a video game context and trolling, right? How can I use this thing to screw with somebody, right? How can I troll somebody with this system? You know, that kind of just basic gut check of, are there parts of this system that can be used in ways that I don't want it to be? You know, understanding just the emotional register, right? The thing Google forgot to do when they rolled out Google Glass, and they didn't realize that, hey, normal people find somebody wearing this super hostile. So if you roll this out, people are going to get into a lot of fights, and it's not actually really going to work because they didn't really take that step of diagnosing what is the affect, what is the emotional response that this system inspires in people. Diagnosing viability, right? Is this system workable, right? If you think about this from a service design perspective, service design is another frame that you should be looking at this stuff from, or is a frame to which you can apply these techniques. You have a service, you have an interaction model that you think you want to deploy. Is it going to work, right? Or are people going to take one look at it and be like, that is so dorky, I am never getting involved in it. So on the other side, when we talk about embodying, we're basically looking at building things, right? Belief is a really interesting thing. You know, this can be in a small group, this can be in a team, et cetera, right? Building a belief that X works, building a belief that the world could look like a thing, right? That this model is possible, that this future is possible, right? This is a bunch of where we get into this kind of unlocking collaborative structures and unlocking that collaborative upside, right? If you have a group of people who all believe together that they can live in a certain way, then they can probably do that. There's a game, Man Himmelokov, Between Heaven and Sea, excuse my pronunciation, that was played in like 2003. It was an Ursula Le Guin themed game, kind of tied to sort of the dispossessed, the light of darkness. And one of the things that a bunch of people from that game learned is actually we can live pretty comfortably together in incredibly close quarters with very little privacy and actually be pretty fulfilled via this kind of set of collective norms. And so one of the outcomes of that game was it was like 6 or 8 people moved in together into a 1-bedroom apartment in Stockholm for like 3 or 4 years. And as a result of that, got to take a very different life journey because they were living basically for free compared to, each, paying a 1/6 or an 1/8 of the rent. And, and that kind of let them take a bunch of other risks that they couldn't otherwise take, right? So this kind of building belief, especially in a small group, can be incredibly powerful. It can also be the same exact kind of toolkit that you use to brainwash people into a cult, which is why we need to talk about ethics and consent and all these things. But it can be a very effective tool. Building rituals, if you have a social script, let's say you're looking at an engineering organization and you want to change the norms around conflict resolution when teams have different interests, right? So you come up with a set of rituals that drive a different set of outcomes, a different set of ways of interacting with these kinds of conflicts. And you get people to opt into a game structure, you learn them collectively, and they almost certainly need to know that your intent is that they get deployed, right? This won't work if you don't have consent and buy-in up front. But you let them play with them and practice them in a context where the stakes aren't super high, right? Where it's not my promotion, my career, et cetera. And you let them see that actually this isn't that scary, right? Actually, this isn't a way to screw you over. I'm not looking at something which is all downside to you. Like, yeah, you're still not going to win every conflict, but now you know that this thing actually works, right? We've done it together. It's not as scary anymore. And what you're doing there is you're building this idea of pastness. That concept comes from the book on legal systems around the world, which I think is on the references slide. And it's basically, the reason why, okay, so if you were a Christian and you go into church and you take, Catholic, you take communion, right? Why is communion serious? Well, it's serious because people have been doing it for a very long time. And if you're part of that cultural tradition that's been doing it for a very long time, you attribute it a certain degree of kind of weight, of solemnness, et cetera, because it has this pastness that's accrued to it. Now you can fake that, right? You can step into a narrative structure where everybody pretends that this thing that we just learned this morning, no, we've been doing this our whole lives, right? And you do it a bunch in there, you attribute a bunch of emotions to it, and then you take the thing out of there, and because you've had this emotional experience of doing it for play, but attributing it that solemnness, some of that carries over, and you can then take it with you back out into the world. So a couple of concepts to sort of close on ways of thinking about systems that are useful for going from a big, large-scale global system or technical system into an embodiable frame that you can collectively perform with a small group of people. Representational fluidity, right? Letting things stand in for other things. Especially in the kind of design fiction sort of world, there's kind of this, there's this need for, this need to not look silly, right? If I represent this technical system accurately in my design fiction, it is therefore a serious design fiction that is as serious as the technical system. Therefore, we must have exact verisimilitude. The problem is that you've now spent most of your bandwidth in designing the world and conveying the world to your participants on verisimilitude, which doesn't actually buy you anything, right? Let things stand in for each other, right? Use lossy abstractions. Don't try to represent systems for real. Figure out what the affordances that matter to the emotions that you want people to experience, the things that you need them to actually do, recreate those affordances. Often it's actually easier to take alibi, to take distance, right? Don't build a global supply chain, build, I don't know, a magic school where something, right? And then pull that in and let people interact with that. Bring just enough of the affordances that you can talk about the logic, about the disposition of the system, right? Transpose the disposition without transposing the system. When you do this well, this lets people pattern match, right? Pattern matching is the thing that gets interesting, right? People have an experience, they see a pattern in a structure, and then they can abstract that. This, by the way, is probably the single most important skill that you can get good at for the next 40 years of your life, right? Is pattern matching in complex systems, because this is what is going to define your ability to act in these complex systems. And finally, iterate. Ship as many times and as fast as possible, right? Never ship your first draft. Always try it for real. Play test. Any system that you're thinking about shipping in the world, you have to play test. If you are building a project where you expect people to interact in a certain way, you have to play test, and you have to give yourself time to revise and iterate after you play test. The faster you start testing, the sooner you're going to correct the really big, deep stuff, and the closer you are to, kind of actually meeting your goals you're likely to get. So I'll leave you with a slight paraphrase of the quote. Live as though you walk in the first days of a healing world, because that's basically what we have to do if we're going to survive all of this. Here's a reading list. As I said, you will get this with the slides. The first two references on this list are specific to the Nordic LARP world. First one is a book that I edited. The LARP world has been collaborating and writing an annual book every year for the past 20, 22, 21 years, quite a while now. A bunch of them are not so great, but there's a lot of really useful stuff in there. And I just pulled together a compendium a few years ago of the papers that I at least thought were interesting. And it was explicitly designed to be, you are coming in from outside of the community and want to understand what this thing is, what this toolkit is. I've been a great believer in this toolkit because to me, it has been the most useful and effective design toolkit for understanding human interaction, human factors, design, et cetera, service design, all these things. So I wanted to make sure that, we were kind of bringing it in a way that could be more open to the world. The second one is the Nordic LARP book, which is basically just a bunch of pictures from games and kind of narratives and stories from the people who wrote them about what they are. This will give you kind of an overview of the scope of what's been done, everything from, like, there was a game in there about the experience of being a cancer patient that was played in a black box room with only green light, full of flour and no talking, or, I don't remember how long, but it was called Luminescence. So we've done a lot of really, really weird stuff. And hopefully, and this will give you an idea of kind of the scope of that. And to a large part, the discourse and the structure of Nordic LARP is kind of dependent on like understanding a bunch of that. So this is the flip side of the essay of theory. And then there's a bunch of other books in there that kind of talk through kind of the context and the structure of a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about here. Some basic systems theory textbooks, a bunch of fiction, which I think is as important as the nonfiction in kind of understanding this way of thinking. So yeah. Do folks have more questions?
A question. I'm wondering what you think of capitalism and if you think some kind of system could replace it, or maybe some pieces of things that could change it. Yeah.
Well, in short, it appears to me that using kind of monetary transactions to solve very small local level resource allocation problems is a useful tool to avoid some parts of planning complexity, right? You know, it's like if you look at like, okay, there's a dozen bakeries, they make different kinds of bread. How do we figure out, you know, who gets what kind of bread or who wants what kind of bread, right? They're good for solving some problems at that level. You know, they're pretty effective at solving some of that level, right? So it's basically a way of liquefying agency and letting people make some decisions on the kind of agentic structures that they want to interact with. And it scales a little bit better in that context than a pure like collective obligation system. Beyond that, when we think about capitalism in context of like modern neoliberal capitalism, et cetera, I think the best thing we could do right now is shoot everyone who ever by any means comes into control of more than $100 million. And then once we've processed that psychic scar, try and figure out how to build stuff back up from then. It is the single most harmful structure the world has seen, bar absolutely nothing other than asteroids.
Thank you, great.
Anyone else? Okay, I guess that's it. Thank you, Ella, so much. This was so inspiring and so easy to follow. Yeah. Anyone from the audience, do you have any questions that you would like to ask? No? Okay.
I was wondering if there's any companies that work with this today. Like,
Do you mean companies that work with LARPs as such?
yeah.
Yes and no. So there are definitely people using toolkits derived from this in the context of like corporate training and that kind of stuff in some places. As an art form, it's primarily collaborative and it's primarily kind of community driven, just because it's like it requires kind of buy-in and participation from everyone as its prerequisite. So it's certainly much easier to do in collaborative structures. There are places where there are kind of companies that are involved in that process, you know, often because like there were times when it's easier just like, you know, dealing with money and that kind of thing. It's, you know, it's sometimes useful to have a corporate vehicle. A lot of the time it's done by associations and stuff though, not like actual companies. But there are definitely things that are kind of spinning off from it in a lot of different directions. Normally, in non-corona times, I would tell you to kind of reach out to the local community. In Sweden, there's a ton of stuff going on. All of that has basically stopped because this is an embodied in-person art form that we can't do right now. But hopefully that will start up again next year. And I think probably late next year. But I think if you're interested in it, that's one of the places that I would look at, is starting to reach out to the community and getting a bit of experience in the medium, you know, and kind of then going from there and seeing, you know, working out from there.
And I have another question. How long does it take to set up a game like this, or from your experience?
Well, it depends. If you're talking about, I mean, like as from a production standpoint, you know, it can be an afternoon, right? If you're taking, there were sort of chamber LARP, which are like, here's a pre-written LARP script, here's 20 pages. And by script, I mean, here's some character definitions, here's some stuff about the world, here's a starting point, you know, here's some workshops to do, that kind of thing, and then go, right? And so it's, you get 6 or 8 friends together and you just go. Writing them, it depends. You know, there are LARP projects that, you know, people have pushed out in 6 weeks for very large scale productions. There's a game called Inside Hamlet, which is 75 players at Eleanor Castle, Helsingborg in Denmark, retelling Hamlet in the context of a LARP, which they made in 6 weeks from go, when they found out that it managed to get the castle. But that was also a crew with 20 years of experience and an amazing death march of a game. For small experiences, if you're thinking about something that's like of the scale where you're looking at in this course, right? I think you can absolutely get something together in a week or 2, that kind of thing. You know, it's basically kind of looking at, you know, what are your goals? What's the system that you want to talk about? Who are the people? What are the affordances of the world? What are they going to do? You know, it's answering a bunch of these questions and then coming up with a way to convey that to them.
Thank you.
I have a question. Well, it's just mostly because like being on Zoom during Corona has been really annoying. But I think it's that whole idea when you're creating a fictional world, the idea of like simulacra and simulation, you know, like when you get into create like this imaginary world, how do you create like, is it that we enjoy something being not real, or just kind of like the anticipation of it? Like when you create like this character, and also the meaning you get afterwards from it. So like, do we want the real thing or do we actually enjoy the fake thing? If you get what I mean.
I mean, I think, so the thing is, the body that you're experiencing the fake emotions with is the same body that you experience the real emotions with, right? You don't actually have 2 bodies. There's actually, the one essay that I couldn't include in the Foundation Stone book, just for space reasons, is called The Player, the Character, and Their Shared Body, which I recommend searching out if you're interested in this. So, you know, in some ways, like the idea of a character is a lie, right? The idea of a character is a convenient lie that we tell ourselves to, you know, explain why we're doing these crazy things. But that's also fine. Like, it's also real. It's a real abstraction, right? You know, and so it's also the alibi. It's the thing that lets us do these things that create that meaning, that create those emotions. So I think in terms of like, in terms of what the interesting bit is, I think the interesting thing is that there isn't a distinction. But yes, it's also useful when you think about this as a medium to be aware of both halves. Thanks for putting the link in there. In general, I'll just put this in the chat. There's a site called Nordic.org where you can find in the wiki there, the Nordic LARP book and the Foundation Stone are downloadable for free from there. And then there's a ton of essays and blog posts, et cetera, from the community. So the gold mine of stuff there. And I'm just going to move those slides to somewhere where you can see them. And I will get you the link in just a second.
Another question, if that's
Yep.
possible. Yeah, so if we're thinking about writing a story, like a book or a video or something, and we're doing it like with the LARP, and you have a story that you're kind of basing the LARP on, but you have improvisation and the unexpected, which makes it interesting. What would that translate to if you're writing a story like a book or a video? What makes something unexpected when when at the same time there's a story, or there's like if you're, for example, describing the power of money in the world, and you already know the story, so to speak, or it's a phenomenon. Yeah, it's a thing that we know what it is, but how do you make the story unexpected and not just feel like information?
So I guess part of it is, so if you want to talk about what money means in the world, that's a frame, right? That's a frame and a theme. It's not the story itself. And you're going to have different characters in that world. So you have a set of rules that kind of embody, this is what money does, right? This is the parts of our interaction with money, which is useful to bring into the fictional frame so that we can kind of like just see the moving parts that are going to embody that system within the scope of the story. But then you're going to have people, and those people have their relationships with with money, right? Or with the world and with each other, right? And they're going to go through that world and they're going to tell different stories, right? Somebody tells the story of trying to beg enough money that they can, eat tonight. And somebody else tells the story of trying to figure out where they're going to park this annoying 30 million euros of capital gains that doesn't subject them to taxes today. I'm not saying these are necessarily interesting stories to tell, but and the meaning of the system comes from everybody talking about those experiences together, right? And probably the things which are interesting here are things which expose, like what's interesting about money in terms of your narrative. What do you want to explore, right? You want to explore power differentials, right? Exploring like what are the set of social relationships, right? Okay, let's make a dating sim, right? Let's make a dating sim where everyone who's dating comes from wildly different class backgrounds, and they're trying to figure out where they're going to have dinner, right? And so, you roll some dice, and then you have the experience, and not that you actually have to roll some dice, but just that, like, if you want to emphasize that this is an arbitrary structure, right? Somebody gets to have the experience of trying to convince their millionaire potential boyfriend that no, I can't go to this Michelin star restaurant on a first date because that's my rent, right? And that's a way of like, okay, now I suddenly have this very visceral understanding of what this means, or the other, I don't know, right? So it depends what the story that you want to tell and what the themes that you want to highlight are.
Okay, thank you. That was a good answer for a bad question.
I just linked the slides in the chat. Somebody can just check and make sure that that link works.
Yes, it is working. Guys, I will also compile all the presentations from all speakers into the website, so you have it all there. Unfortunately, I will need to cut this session here because in 10 minutes there is the next session. Ella, thank you so much for your time and for all endless inspiration.
Thank you very much. I hope you all had fun, and possibly at some point I will hear about what crazy things you come up with from all this. Go do something weird.
For sure. Expect to get an invitation for the museum. It will open on the 20th of November.
Looking forward to it.
Yes.
Talk to y'all later. Bye.
Thank you.
So guys, go out from this room and then come in again at 3:30. We will have an open panel. And if you missed it on Slack, we have also another speaker. Her name is Basadi, and she will join as well. So see you in 10 minutes, 9 minutes.
Shai?
Yes?
Shai, it is 3:30. The open panel is 3:30.
Yes, exactly. Which
So
is
it's
9 minutes, no?
no, in 9 minutes it's 3 o'clock.
What? Okay.
Shai is traveling between the space and time.
Right. Oh, okay, yeah, here it's 4 and then, yeah, at 4:30. Sorry. Yeah, so we have 30 minutes.
Oh, lucky.
Okay. See
Thank
you in 30 minutes.
See
Ciao.
you. Ciao.